In the vast universe of stories involving the Brazilian national team and its stars, some seem so extraordinary that they could be mere legends. But what I am about to tell you today is something that, for a long time, remained shrouded in mystery. It was an ordinary night in 1970 when Brazil celebrated its third World Cup championship and Pelé, the king of football, was being hailed by the world. Amid the heat of the celebration, a piece of clothing, seemingly simple but full of history, slipped from Pelé's hands and ended up in the hands of a stranger. A shirt. But it wasn't just any shirt. It was the shirt Pelé wore during one of the most important matches of that World Cup. What no one could imagine was that this shirt would disappear for decades, and, when it reappeared, it would completely transform the life of an ordinary man. A man who, unknowingly, held in his hands a true fortune. But how did this shirt end up in his hands? And how did something that could have been just a personal trophy become the golden ticket to a life of wealth? What you are about to hear is a story of unexpected encounters, difficult decisions, and a secret that was kept for nearly half a century. A journey that starts with a simple shirt and ends with a surprising conclusion. Stay with me, because the unfolding of this story will surprise you with every detail. It all began in a packed stadium in the heat of Mexico in 1970. Brazil had just achieved the ultimate glory, their third World Cup championship. The final whistle marked more than just a victory. It was a historic moment, and Pelé, the king of football, was at the center of attention. He was carried on the shoulders of his teammates, while crowds screamed and cried with emotion. Amid the frenzy, something peculiar happened. Pelé, caught up in the euphoria, took off his shirt, and before anyone could predict it, threw it into the stands. It was a spontaneous gesture, a thank you to the fans who had traveled thousands of miles to see him in action. The shirt flew, spinning through the air, until it disappeared into the crowd. The story of the shirt could have ended there, buried in forgetfulness or in the hands of some discreet collector. But it ended up with Antonio. Antonio was a 23-year-old mechanic living in a simple neighborhood on the outskirts of São Paulo. He didn't have the money to go to Mexico, but like many Brazilians passionate about football, he was watching the live broadcast at a bar. What no one knew was that Antonio had a distant cousin, Carlos, who was at the stadium that day. Carlos was a simple man, but full of luck. Somehow, he was in the right place at the right time, and he was the one who grabbed the shirt when it fell. When he returned to Brazil, Carlos was received like a local hero. Pelé's shirt was a treasure everyone wanted to see and touch. But to him, it was just an object with little significance. After all, Carlos wasn't a fervent football fan, and soon the shirt began to fade from his life. One day, during a visit from Antonio, Carlos, almost as if offering something of no value, said, "Man, you love football so much, take this shirt. It's just taking up space here at home." Antonio couldn't believe what he was hearing. He hesitated for a few seconds, but didn't want to seem too eager. With a controlled smile, he accepted the gift, unaware that that piece of fabric would change his life forever. And so, the king's shirt left a house where it was just a common object and ended up with someone who truly valued what it represented. However, at that time, Antonio had no idea of the true value it carried. Little did he know that years later, the story of that shirt would place his name in the headlines and change the course of his life in a way he could never have imagined. Antonio took the shirt home as if it were a personal trophy. He didn't know much about collectors, auctions, or the sports memorabilia market. To him, the shirt was an emotional relic, a piece of Brazil's history, and most importantly, a part of King Pelé. In his modest home, Antonio made sure to fold the shirt carefully and store it in a drawer. He even thought about hanging it in a frame in the living room, but reconsidered, imagining what his neighbors might say. The neighborhood was simple, and displaying something so unique could attract the wrong kind of attention. The years passed. Antonio got married, had children, and life went on. He would tell the story of the shirt to friends and family, but no one seemed to fully believe him. For many, it was just another one of those exaggerated bar stories. If that shirt really belonged to Pelé, why don't you sell it? It must be worth a fortune. A coworker would say, teasing as he wiped his oily hands in the workshop where they worked. Antonio would always reply with a smile, because there are things money can't buy. The truth, however, was a bit different. Antonio knew the shirt had value, but he had no idea how much. He was a simple man, with no connections or knowledge to help him explore this world. And in a way, he was afraid. Afraid that by trying to learn more, he might end up losing what was most precious to him. So the shirt remained forgotten in that drawer while time passed. However, fate is a curious thing, and the story of the shirt was far from over. Everything started to change in 1995 when Antonio's oldest daughter, Juliana, decided to enroll in a journalism course. During a class, the professor casually mentioned how historical objects linked to football, like shirts worn by famous players, were becoming increasingly valuable in the international market. Take Pelé's shirt, for example, the professor said casually. If someone had a piece like that today, it could change their life. Imagine, it must be worth millions. Intrigued, Juliana remembered the old story her father always told. She had never seen the shirt with her own eyes, but decided to investigate. One weekend, during a visit to her parents' house, she casually asked, "Dad, what about that Pelé shirt you always talk about? Do you still have it?" Antonio, sitting in his rocking chair, just laughed. "Of course I have it. It's in the drawer of the closet." Juliana's eyes widened. It was as if what she had always thought was just a family myth had gained real weight. Without wasting any time, she asked her father to show her the shirt. When Antonio opened the drawer and pulled out the shirt, Juliana was speechless. The aged fabric, the faded number 10, and the Brazilian national team crest still intact. It was like holding a piece of history. "Dad, is this real?" she asked, almost breathless. Antonio shrugged. To him, it was just an object full of sentimental value. To Juliana, it seemed like something much bigger, and it was at that moment that the story of the shirt, which had until then been a secret kept in a drawer, began to take on a new dimension. Juliana couldn't get the image of the shirt out of her head. That piece of clothing her father had kept stored for years, with no apparent monetary value to him, now seemed to carry the weight of a treasure. Curiosity consumed her. She knew her father would never care about the money the shirt could generate, but she couldn't ignore what the professor had said in class. Maybe it was time to truly discover the value of that relic. The next day, Juliana decided to gather more information. She began researching historical items linked to Brazilian football and quickly came across reports of auctions for shirts worn by famous players. The most notable, of course, was the shirt worn by Pelé in the 1970 final. She came across images of shirts similar to her father's being sold for millions of reais in international auctions. It was hard to believe, but everything pointed to one thing. Her father's shirt really could be worth a lot of money. Determined, she sought out experts in sports memorabilia and contacted a rare item appraiser. The expert, an elderly man named Roberto, was known for his work with authentic sports collections. When he heard Juliana's story and the description of the shirt, he was skeptical, but asked her to bring the item to his office. Pelé's shirt is a global symbol, but there are many fakes out there. Only professional analysis can confirm whether this piece is legitimate, Roberto explained over the phone. Nervous, Juliana took the shirt to the agreed location, not knowing what to expect. The moment Roberto held it in his hands, his eyes lit up. This is real," he said, with a seriousness that sent chills down Juliana's spine. The stitching, the fabric, the number 10, the crest. I've never seen anything like it. This is a treasure. We're talking about a one-of-a-kind piece, a piece of world football history. Juliana couldn't believe it. What her father had only considered a sentimental keepsake was now an item of incalculable value. But even with the confirmation, she knew something was still missing. Public recognition. The piece needed to be authenticated, for only then could it reach its true value in the market. But the question that remained was, how would Antonio react when he found out that what he had always treated with such humility could completely change his life and his family's? "You're not serious, are you?" Antonio asked when Juliana finally told him what had happened. He laughed as if it were all a big joke. Juliana, with seriousness, explained the shirt's potential, how it could place them in a financial position they had never imagined. Antonio, although skeptical, was beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation. "I never imagined it had so much value," said Antonio, looking at the shirt now laid on the kitchen table. "Carlos would have gone crazy over all of this." But at the same time, something told him that maybe this was the moment to honor Carlos's legacy. He knew his friend would never have sold the shirt, and probably wouldn't want him to either. However, times had changed, and he also knew that his family could greatly benefit from the sale. It was a difficult decision. With the authentication complete and the value confirmed, Juliana sought an auction for sports memorabilia to sell the shirt. The world now knew of the existence of the King Pelé shirt that Carlos, Antonio's cousin, had grabbed during that fateful 1970 match. The auction was about to take place, and Antonio, despite his hesitations, knew there was no turning back. They were about to make history. The auction was a landmark event. When Pelé's shirt was finally sold for 10 million reais, Antonio's life took an astonishing turn. He couldn't believe what was happening, but at the same time, he knew the shirt had irreversibly changed his life. Deep down, Antonio had always known that piece of history was worth something, but he never imagined that fate would lead him to such a great reward. However, amid the euphoria and gratitude, Antonio couldn't forget Carlos. He remembered his cousin with affection, and the image of him, with his simple and generous smile, never left his mind. Carlos wasn't a man of many possessions or riches, but he had always been someone willing to help. For Antonio, that gesture of giving him the shirt without knowing what it would mean in the future was the greatest proof of his character. But since Carlos had already passed away, Antonio knew he would never see the fruits of it. So instead of letting the longing consume him, Antonio did what he felt was most just. He dedicated part of the money from the sale of the shirt to Carlos's family, who, until that moment, was still facing financial difficulties. With a heavy heart, but a sense of duty fulfilled, Antonio sought out Carlos's wife and children. He gave them a significant portion of the money without ceremony, without expecting recognition. For him, it was the way to honor Carlos's memory, a man who cared little for wealth, but in some way had been the starting point for everything that had happened. Antonio knew that Carlos never cared about money, but now, Pelé's shirt became a symbol not only of the history of Brazilian football, but also of a legacy of kindness and generosity, and Antonio wanted that to endure. In the end, what seemed like a simple stroke of luck for Carlos, catching the shirt in the stadium, resulted in a life-changing event for Antonio. But it also served to transform the life of Carlos's family, who finally had the chance to escape the constant struggle for a better future. The story of Pelé's shirt, which had once been just a keepsake tucked away in a drawer, now symbolized more than football. It represented fate, love, and the generosity of a person who, although no longer alive, left a legacy that would be remembered forever.